gossiping ghouls and goblins. Welcome back to the Mausoleum, where we spill the tea on true crime and other miscellaneous macabre. I'm Autumn,
And I'm Haley.
and this is Don't You Know? This is a trigger warning. This is an unedited true crime podcast, and we are explicit. Many episodes contain mentions of child abuse, murder, sexual abuse, domestic violence, severe neglect, animal abuse, necrophilia, bestiality, incest, suicides, and other sensitive topics. If you're squeamish, why the fuck are you here? Now, without further ado, this is the episode of
The case of Sharkception. There was an arm at the bottom of the sea. A shark swam by and said, "Yummy." It was just his luck to get gobbled up as soon as the fingers hit his tummy. A bigger shark, a bigger appetite, but even he didn't win the fight against being captured and displayed by the worst predator to date. The shark, he was distressed, cooped up in his prison, you see, distraught in his cozy Coogee tank. The tiger shark fell ill and sank to the floor with a shake and a shudder. He vomited his supper, and in the mess was the arm from the bottom of the sea.
Fucking bars.
Now the question is, who does that arm belong to, and why was it in the ocean in the first place?
Why? Why, Haley?
Well, my pretties, let me take you back to April 1935, where a tiger shark was admitted to the Coogee Aquarium baths in Sydney, Australia. And a week after its capture, the tiger shark upchucks the tattooed remains of a human forearm.
Oh, I think I've heard about this one.
Have you?
I think so.
It's fucking crazy.
It's been a while, so I don't remember it, but I definitely think I've heard this one before.
Really, I hadn't. I just stumbled across it, and I was
I
like,
couldn't tell you where. Probably another podcast, if I'm being completely honest, but it's a good one. I think it's a good one.
neat. All right.
So, is this going to be a two-parter?
It very well could be, depending on
Okay.
how fast I talk.
Well, I do have to remind you to talk slower because sometimes you're like, but
Yeah,
that is just
the way it be. I will work on that. So, as it goes, the owners of the Coogee Aquarium, Charlie and Bert Hobson, summoned authorities, Detective Frank Head and Detective John Mannion, who rushed to the aquarium to investigate. After they were assured the arm could not have been placed in the tank by anyone and was in fact vomited by the shark, they collected the remains for investigation.
so. This was just a week after this shark showed up.
Yeah,
Okay.
roughly about that. The forearm and hand were still intact despite being partially digested. A distinct tattoo of a pair of blue outline boxers and red shorts squaring up adorned the arm. The medical examiner determined that the arm had been severed rather than bitten off, and now the case was being treated as a homicide.
Oh, dude, the plot thickens.
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily a trained surgical cut either. It was definitely a hack job, but more so than a bite. Authorities released a sketch of the tattoo to the Sydney Truth that a Edwin Smith would later identify as his brother's forearm.
Oh,
He called in to say that the tattoo belonged to his brother, Jim Smith, and who had been missing since April 8th. He and his sister-in-law, Gladys, Jim's wife, went to the police station where they would positively identify the arm to belong to the missing Jim Smith. The arm was then given to the fingerprint department headed by John Lindsay, who also carefully removed the skin from the fingertips and then applied a padding to the thin samples so that he could get a clear copy of the thumb and the ring finger. With the fingerprints and a possible name, the detectives went through their police files to see if there were any records for Jim Smith. And they were in luck. Why? Oh. Indeed. They were in luck because Jim did have a long history with Johnny Law. So his prints were on file, and when compared to the prints that they took from the arm, they were a good match. Jim had been previously charged in 1932 for allowing illegal betting on a premises that he had owned.
can't do that.
Nope. That same day, the investigation was given to a team of detectives composed of Frank Matthews and Leonard Almond and detectives Devereaux. Gladys would tell the detectives that Jim had gone down to Cronulla, where he was going to take a as he described, wealthy bloke from another state fishing, who is to be paid the equivalent of about $500. She told them that he was to meet this fella at the Hotel Cecil in Cronulla, and that's the place Jim said that he would be able to be contacted. She brought a photograph out of her husband and told the detectives that he left their house wearing a gray suit, shoes, a blue shirt, a gray felt hat, and he was also carrying a small brown leather bag that belonged to their 17-year-old son, Raymond. During this interview, Gladys also revealed that on April 13th, 5 days after her husband had left for Cronulla, her neighbor, who often received messages for her, had taken one from a man with a gruff voice, and the message was to tell Mrs. Smith that Mr. Smith will not be home until Monday morning. But of course, he never arrived. During the day, there must have been a conversation where Detective Sergeant Matthews revealed Jim Smith was not just an anonymous victim, but a man known to both men through their secret and informer networks. The previous year, Jim had been interviewed by Matthews in relation to a mysterious sinking of a luxury yacht called the Pathfinder, and then a few months later in relation to a case of bank fraud. Detectives saw that there was a possibility that his death was connected to these former matters because Matthew had a prior history with the victim. This gave him a head start as he knew the victim's associates well, especially Jim's longtime mate, Patty Brady. Later that afternoon, Detectives Almond and McDermott climbed into a car and headed to Shades Creek Wharf in the grim industrial area of St. Peter's, where the shark was the center of all the excitement, where the shark that was the center of all of this excitement died the previous day.
All right, so the shark's dead, and the job of disposing of the carcass was given to a fish oil merchant named Arthur Russell, whose men hauled the shark from the aquarium pool and took it to Russell's factory beside Shades Creek. After Russell disemboweled the shark in his bloody leather apron and scooped out the contents of its stomach onto the wharf, the detectives recorded that they observed the bones of a smaller shark, a small amount of mackerel, and other small fish, and a good-sized point of the smaller shark's backbone, but no other trace of human flesh bones or fragments of clothing. Once Russell was finished with picking through the remains he wanted to collect, they rolled the creature into the wharf and let it sink.
Oh, poor shark.
So it's just the arm.
Okay.
The next day on April 30th, Detective Matthews and Detective Allman, Detective McDermott, and Detective Coleman, there's like so many fucking detectives, headed to Cronulla armed with photographs of the missing man and his associate, Patrick Brady. They canvassed the neighborhoods, asking barmen, real estate agent, boat hire, shop owners, taxi drivers, anybody who might have any knowledge of Jim Smith, his companions, or of any fishing trip that would lead to the outstanding progress. Or, excuse me, all of this work would lead to outstanding progress by the end of the week, where the detectives at the CIB, or the Central Intelligence Bureau, identified a location where the murder had taken place and theorized what could have happened to the body, and were well on their way to solving the case of the shark arm murder. Of course, all of this was sensationalized by the newspapers, especially The Truth, who heckled the detectives without remorse, giving the description of the arm on April 28th and describing the murder as a tragedy such that, as Edgar Allan Poe never dreamed of in his weirdest fiction, a tragedy that is without parallel in the history of crime the world over. End quote. In just over a week, the shark arm murder had become a national sensation, prompting the detectives to put their heels to the ground. Jim Smith was born. Oh, so now we're going to tell you a little bit about Jim Smith.
Who is Jim Smith?
Yeah, softer transition there. Jim Smith was born in England in 1891, possibly in the parts of Camberwell, South London. He was the eldest of 4 children, with 2 brothers and a sister. Though they grew up poor, the family must have been loving, as they remained intensely loyal to each other throughout their lives. Such is the case for many children in the early 1900s. He could only have the bare minimum of schooling before he had to go work as a miner to help support the family. Courageously, at the age of 18, he decided to pursue a better life and emigrate to Australia in October 1909. He sailed third class from London. There he would quickly settle into the working class suburbs of inner Sydney, and by November he was described as a tall, well-built, good man with his fists. or a man. He was a tall, well-built man who was good with his fist and had a happy-go-lucky nature. He was later joined by his brother the next year, and then they would remain closest of pals until the very end. In his early years, Jim worked as a barman and a billiard room attendant, and like many of his peers, he fancied himself a boxer. It was a very popular sport back in the day, and Jim would take up an amateur boxing position as a welterweight at a popular inner city venue. Many years after his arm surfaced and Jim's identity was confirmed, his ex-trainer, Jack Burke, was so moved that he contacted the Truth and told the newspaper that he had trained Jim just before the outbreak of World War One. Oh, you're good. He gave the following description of the young man. He knew Jim Smith to be beautifully built in his younger years. His body was splendidly molded, and unlike a lot of Englishmen, he had a buoyant temperament and was free and open about everything and was thoroughly a good sport after the war broke out. Oh, excuse me. After the war broke out, I lost the run of him, but it all came back to me in a flash when I saw the drawing of the tattoo mark on his arm. And that was one of the first things I noticed when we met him. The picture of the two boxers shaping up was one of the finest chaps. He was one of the finest chaps in the world. I don't know how to fucking read. 1916, Jim would marry Gladys Malloy, a tall, good-looking milliner, and his brother Edward was his best man.
Like Popeye,
You can
olive
kind of imagine a
oil.
Popeye.
I don't know. That's just what I'm imagining.
Find a picture of Gladys. Although I did read that there were pictures of her in the newspapers.
That side. Who's the other one?
Reginald Holmes.
Okay, well someone. What a handsome fella.
Well, he might not have won any beauty pageants. All right, so where were we at? Okay, yeah. So in 1916, he's marrying Gladys Malloy. His brother was his best man, and a year after their marriage, they would have their only child, Raymond. In his early years, Jim ran a billiard room in the Darling Street, Roselle, and in 1920 he became the proprietor of the Roselle Sports Club, which he had as a billiard parlor where he said he had set an illegal starting price to enter, which was an illegal betting business. But it was not necessarily enforced. It was illegal, but like it's just kind of
Yeah.
overlooked it. They're like, yeah, whatever.
I guess, sir,
But
I'll
when
look the other way.
yeah,
I'll
look the
look,
other way.
I'll look the other way. I don't see anything wrong here.
In fact, let me put 10 down. Let's do it. I got a shilling or two.
10 on black, baby. 10 on bread. I don't know.
Until that is a political shift where illegal betting and parlors and all of that were given the shakedown. And that's how Jim's career into crime
That
began.
is where he became the utmost respected criminal.
Yes.
Respected?
Well,
He did end up not. Let's find out how.
so during his time running the legal side hustle, he had saved several £100s, which is quite a bit. I mean, that's like several 100,000, approximately. He would eventually bring his widowed mother, and all of his other siblings to Australia. They were very proud of him. They encouraged his ambition, and in 1925 he sold his interest in the Roselle Sports Club to strike out in a new and surprising direction. He wanted to open his own billiard room and sporting club, where he would enter into an odd partnership with William Young, who was an architect from the wealthy North Shore area.
Definitely in the roaring 20s.
Oh, yes.
Roaring 20s. Move here, do this. I have time to fluctuate and try big career move.
Right before it all fell to the Depression.
Yep.
Just a few short years later. This arrangement with the prominent gentleman was to Jim and this prominent gentleman had an arrangement that the Mr. Young would finance for, oh my God. Jim Smith and William Young had an arrangement where Young would finance the construction of flats through a network of business associates, and Jim would supervise the building work, an area which he had no experience, and there were no doubt a few dodgy deals involved. At this point, this is when Jim had entered a world of privilege and corruption, and where he would meet the people that would eventually play the part in his gruesome demise.
Ah.
For the next 3 years, William Young and Smith built at least 2 blocks of flats in the harborside suburbs of Yarra Flats and McMahon's Point. In McMahon's Point, they took out the contract in Jim's trading name, J.P. Smith. Whether he knew it or not is contested, but Jim did become an integral part of the scam, where he acted as a dummy contractor for a group of wealthy businessmen who raised just enough capital to get the flats completed while leaving many contractors and suppliers unpaid. Upon the completion of the flats, they were then sold to wealthy businessmen who took a profit. Eventually, Jim had to file for bankruptcy, and the majority of the contractors and suppliers never saw their money. This left Jim in quite the pickle, as the big brains behind the scam were Reginald Holmes and Albert Stannard.
Hmm.
They were all about the same age as Jim. They were from much different backgrounds.
Did Jim know this was a scam, or did he just think this was going swimmingly?
No, he knew that it was a scam.
Okay.
He was the one over constructing,
A scam.
overlooking. Yes. Um, These dashing young men were Sydney Harbor royalty. Born and bred in the upper class North Shore, their tough as nails forebearers, established successful boat building and ridge businesses in the 1850s. Reginald Holmes's father was considered to be one of the finest boat builders on the harbor, turning out yachts, loggers, and speedboats of superb quality. And the families of Wickman's Point Yard, these 1930s playboys, saw the harbor as their playground, and they loved to race their yachts and speedboats, despite that in 1920 in 1920 tombs in 1922,
I have
Holmes
no idea what you're trying to say.
flipped his speedboat and nearly drowned. But enough about them. Um, this is to say that there were boats all over the place. Everything coming into Sydney and out of Sydney were on boats. Boats. All the men knew boats.
Boats! Do you know what that's from? Comment below. She was in a boat commercial. Boats. Boats. It's a bad one. It's funny. It's funny in this
Okay.
It sounds stupid talking about it, but it's funny for the show.
All right. I gotcha. Boats. Indeed. This would prove to be a sneaky and lucrative business for illicit goods. Reginald and Albert would employ tough skippers with criminal records and arrangements that these men would smuggle in contraband, who would then receive a percentage of anything that their bosses made. This kept Stannard at good distance, while being able to make money and turning a blind eye to the illegal activities. Some of these items were run-of-the-mill perfumes, tobacco, alcohol, stockings, different kinds of oils. More than occasionally, there were drugs, specifically cocaine. Yes,
Hell yeah.
hidden among the coffee beans from South America and the rice from Asia, were opium and cocaine.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say how bad addiction was throughout the 1920s and 30s, because like cocaine was in fucking everything,
Yeah, that's true.
um, especially in your average person's nose.
Mm-hmm.
Australia had the highest per capita consumption of cocaine in the world by the 1930s. It sucked because the Depression hit right after.
Yeah.
That withdrawal had to have been throwing people off buildings.
I would think. The roaring 20s to the depressing 30s. Yeah.
Yep,
I mean, they were going high and then they went low.
I don't really blame for a whole lot of like what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Nuts. Because Jim was in a tough spot. He was desperate, and competition with other men for work was ridiculous. Hardly anything was available. After having declared bankruptcy in March, Jim and the family fell on hard times. Jim becoming quite bitter that he had been given grief and had to file bankruptcy while the rich scammers got to profit off of the contract fraud. Jim would devise a plan where he would hold the reputation of the prominent men's reputations for ransom. He approached Reginald Holmes and asked him for a loan of £300 to open an athletic club. And much like the billiard rooms that he had owned 10 years prior, Jim went up to Holmes and was like, hey, loan me £300 so now I can open up an athletic club like I used to have. And if you don't, I'm going to let everybody know about those sketchy contracts and how you didn't pay anybody in the end. So Holmes coughed up the money, which put Jim back in familiar territory. He registered to be the proprietor of the Roselle Athletic Club on Darling Street. So this probably wasn't like the best idea because who's going to be able to pay for a gym membership?
In the 30s.
Yeah, in the 30s. Nobody can afford bread. And he's like, these fucking mics are cheap. And this is essentially like getting a Planet Fitness
When you're
membership when
you have no money.
you have no money. I have no job. I have no money. Can't go bet on illegal billiards and use gym equipment.
Right. And think that's gonna. Yep. It makes sense. Smart use of money. Smart investment.
Exactly. Also, like I said, the political shift was happening. So in 1932, the athletic club was raided for the illegal betting. 26 people were arrested, and this is when he was fingerprinted and charged for allowing the illegal betting on the premises.
That's where the fingerprints came from, everybody.
Mm-hmm. Also, where his hefty fine came from. And his assets were seized because he couldn't pay for it. But this wouldn't stop him from trying to get rich quick. He would go on to buy an illegal fruit machine, which is like those poker slot machines I'm talking about.
Oh, okay,
You
yeah.
hit the handle, it
Yeah.
turns cherries. Yeah. Still trying to skirt the system. But he was raided again following May in 1933. He appeared on bail, and this would dry up all of his funds. He was back to where he was started. He was back to where he started, and in a desperate attempt, he called up his old benefactor, Reginald Holmes, and blackmailed him once again to be employed to drive the launches, which is the boats, out in the harbor for, wealthy businessmen. So he would do this all throughout the summer and into August, where Jim concocted another harebrained scheme. The athletic club was now owned by a Jessie Byers, who reported that her billiard balls had been stolen and that she suspected Jim Smith very well could be a person of interest. So the detectives went over there and they were talking to Jim, and we're going to have to bring you in because you can't just be going stealing billiard balls. And he's like, well, wait a minute. I might actually have some information that could be. And we're back. Okay, so we were discussing how Jim was saying that he had information that could be very interesting to the police if they just let him return the billiard balls and convince Jesse not to press any charges. So this is the way that it went. And he would eventually sit down with the police, where he told him that he was part of one of the best smuggling cases in Sydney, and if they gave him a chance, he would tell them of a launch that he was going to be driving for an old friend. They asked him, what are you smuggling? And he's like, well, some cigarettes, some, some spam, some drugs. All right. He said not only was there smuggling fraud, or not only was there drug smuggling, but there was fraud, as Reginald Holmes and Albie Stannard were enamored with marine insurance fraud. They presented the opportunity. They were presented an opportunity when a Mr. Williams, who was the managing director of the Woolworths Limited department store, was selling a luxurious motor cruiser called the Pathfinder. It was long, sleek, and beautiful, and built with craft. The interiors were highly polished with genuine walnut. It turned heads, and a week after its arrival in Brisbane, Williams was approached by Holmes and asked if he wanted to sell the cruiser. At first, Williams said no, but he was pestered, and by February in 1933, he finally agreed on a sale price of £3,350. Holmes quickly paid Williams with a check, saying that he was acting as an agent for a register of a very wealthy retired gentleman named Albert Thompson. Albert Thompson was actually his golf friend and just a straw man for this ordeal, who took the meager £500 and agreed to act as the dummy owner so that police would not get suspicious of anything later on. However, the police investigation would uncover this complex schemes between Holmes and Stannard, despite how much distance they placed between themselves from the ownership of the Pathfinder. So they insured the Pathfinder, right? They bought it for 32, insured it for 35, and then they sent Jim out over the course of a year to party on the yacht. He'd bring his family, he'd bring his friends, eventually brings his mate, Patty, on it, tells him all about what Albert and Reginald want him to do.
Okay.
Okay? Sorry, I'm not going to read the notes because they're just like so dry. Fuck's sake. Very technical. So, for the sake of time, and take 4. All right. So, in the interest of being a little bit of a podcast, I'm just going to kind of talk off the cuff from memory here. So, like I said, Jim Smith was employed by Reginald Holmes and Albert Stannard to scuttle, meaning sink, their Pathfinder in an insurance fraud. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
On one of the last excursions, he brought his friend Patty and told him about the whole plot. He spent his life, doing petty crimes and whatnot too.
Okay.
Yep. By his own account, trouble stalked him throughout his life. He said his first dance with Johnny Law was being caught for throwing a rock through a window of a school when he was only 11. And, honestly, kids are dumb.
Yeah.
My cousin did that once, too.
It just happens.
His family was supportive, coming to his defense and pleading with the judge for leniency. However, the judge decided that this was a very serious offense and sentenced the young boy to 5 years in boys' reformatory school. Here he was the youngest boy and found that working in the yard was good for him. He acquired basic farming skills and eventually decided to escape a few months before his sentence was over.
Bad decision, but nice that he discovered himself a little bit.
He did indeed discover himself through his travels in the area through the rural areas of New South Wales. He worked odd jobs on different farms, and for a while this would keep him out of trouble. Then in 1915 he enlisted in the army to fight in World War I. And long story short, trouble found Patty in the form of a whiskey bottle and being AWOL. After his arrest, Patty discovered that he had a knack for forging signatures. He and his mates would steal leaf passes that he would then scrawl the neat signatures of various commanding officers. He did this until he was honorably discharged in 1919. Returning home, he worked as an electrician and would meet Jim Smith sometime in the early 20s, probably in Jim's Roselle Sports Club. The two would become chummy, and both of them are in and out of jail cells and courtrooms throughout their, young adult lives.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's the cast. Lots of figures going around. We have, 1,700 detectives. We've got Jim, we've got Patty, we've got their wives, Grace and Gladys. Grace, I think.
Got a lot of factors, a lot of people. There's the down low. Go back and rewind if you don't remember. I don't have the luxury. We're going forward. Next time, diagrams, probably.
I mean, yeah,
But
a lot,
still.
a lot of moving parts. So I'm not going to have the time to dive into everyone's backgrounds and remain sane. So we'll just say that both men had loving families that often paid the price for their misdeeds.
Okay.
I will mention that times were tough, and coming by an honest day's work was difficult. While Jim was running illegal gambling dens, Patty was forging checks for ridiculous amounts, oftentimes involving unwitting strangers and other times working with a gang of unsavory characters.
Wrong crowd.
Yeah, the wrong crowd indeed. And the forerunners of this wrong crowd, Jim and Patty. Jim would bring Patty into the fold of the Pathfinder insurance fraud, giving him all the nitty gritty details of the prominent men that he worked for. He told him how the Pathfinder was insured and planned to sail the seas for a year before Jim would sink it. And that time would come in April 1934. Jim sailed down the central coast where he would find the perfect spot to be the yacht's grave. He spent the night weighing her down and damaging the water intake pipes, letting in water a bit more slowly than he had anticipated.
Okay. Bad decision, but okay.
That's what he was paid to do.
I
This was
guess.
the job, actually.
It was.
It
He
was.
is doing what he was paid to do.
But,
Just a bad decision,
rich men just trying to get richer.
I guess.
Fucking ridiculous.
I guess.
Just after dawn appeared on the horizon, Jim made his way above deck only to find a ship headed in his direction. Without haste, he jumped into the dinghy and rowed as fast as he could to the shore. This ship was the Walla II, transporting coal from the Catherine Hill Bay to the power stations at White Bay and Balmain in Sydney. The officer spotted the yacht that was now low in the water and changed his course to see if they could help. As they came closer, the officer saw that there was a man in the dinghy about 30 feet from the stricken yacht who was rowing to the shore. The ship steamed past, just a mere 50 feet away, with the officer calling out to ask if they could help the man. The man in the dinghy ignored him, and the ship continued on, where later in the morning the officer would report the bizarre encounter to the police because something seemed suspicious. Like if your yacht goes down and someone's coming by to help you, you'd rather spend the next 4 hours rowing to shore than get on the big old steamship. I don't know if it was a steamship, but whatever.
Seems like a lot of unnecessary working out.
Yeah, why do you want to? Okay.
Trying to get swole.
Right? Definitely after 4 hours, those
Trying to get
muscles are
swole.
going to be swollen.
For sure.
Once he was ashore, he made his way to the local police station, where he told them fabricated story that he was on his way to Sydney in the Pathfinder when a leak occurred and water began pouring in, which flooded the engine, and the boat was down, carried by the north wind and the current, where it remained. Excuse me. He then asked if he could use the telephone to call the owner and let him know of the sinking. His brain must have been a bit scrambled because he forgot to use the code names that they had previously come up with and instead asked for Mr. Holmes when the other end of the line was answered. After the call, Jim immediately went to North Sydney to Reginald Holmes's house to tell him of the catastrophe in person. Upon Jim's departure, Holmes would call Stannard to tell him the news. With all that being said, the jig was up, with the officers called to the Sydney police. With the officer having called the Sydney police, an investigation would occur. And with the coppers sniffing around, Holmes and Stannard knew they couldn't file the claim with the insurance. Now, the insurance guys are asking questions. Like, why is there a police report about sinking?
It's not lining up.
Yeah, what was it doing out there? Why was it manned by just one person? Everything being a little suspicious, so the men were forced to drop the claim, which meant nobody got paid. And they were down,
Oh yeah.
well, more than that, they were down a yacht. They were down the initial 3,200 investment to buy the yacht, and they were down an additional 3,500
for
for
Or
the
for the
insurance premium, whatever. So they had leveraged. What was it? I think I might mention it further down, but Holmes had leveraged his life insurance policies in order to
dumbasses.
show collateral to his business
For the
partner.
yep. So it was a bad mistake.
Yeah, there was just nobody getting paid was a very bad thing. Very bad thing. So Jim was in hot water.
Yeah.
The
Oh, he didn't make the money and it failed with him.
Of course, this upset Jim doubly, citing that it was bullshit that he was the one to go out on a limb, sink the ship, and regardless of whether the insurance paid out, he was going to get his money.
Okay.
These were prominent silver tails, as he described them, so people with a silver spoon in their mouth,
Mm-hmm.
and they had money. Yeah, to his point of view, they lost a couple $100, but he was out,
Couple of thousand.
a couple of thousand, comparatively speaking.
Right.
They were going to pay
He
him.
needed some more money.
He needed capital. He did eventually reveal his part in the scheme to his wife Gladys, who would later tell investigators that Jim resorted to drinking even more heavily now that all of this was going on. In fact, like everybody involved was just slurping them back,
Mm-hmm.
which I can understand because I mean we're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars after everything's said and done, and it's not just the money; it's the reputations
Right.
of these prominent figures. I mean, you got to think of like I don't know, like if that billboard realtor,
Mm-hmm.
if his name got dragged through the mud for insurance fraud.
Slander.
Yeah, I mean, it was true,
Well,
but like, it isn't until proven guilty in a court of law.
it's
You know.
slander, and that is just our opinion.
Anyway, uh, so of course they have their assets and their image to protect. They don't need to be seen as criminals because a lot of their power comes from that reputation. So with the police poking around and the insurance company asking questions, Stannard decided to meet with Jim to buy his silence for 150 pounds, which he graciously accepted, and 80 of which his wife promptly grabbed to pay off their debts.
Okay.
She was a smart lady.
Yeah. Like, thank you.
During the investigation between the police and the insurance company, nobody could keep their story straight, which again led to the insurance claim being dropped and the subsequent investigation, coming to a halt.
Right.
Because of their unwitting assistance in the fraud scheme, the bankers who insured and, um, gave the seal of approval for the loan didn't want to get any lawyers involved, so they decided not to pursue any action against Horse and Regiment. Now this is where all the blackmail starts coming in. As Patty, who was always looking for a quick buck, forging checks for 450 pounds from, you know, prominent people who definitely aren't just shelling out that much money,
Mm-hmm.
saw his in so that him and Jim could begin blackmailing both Holmes and Stannard. While all of this is going on, Jim and Patty are resorting to their old methods of making a quick buck as well. Patty's still forging checks, um, which would garner the attention of Detective Matthews, who I believe I've kind of glossed over. But like I said, there's a lot of characters. I got to cut for time, but they did the work. Yeah, Detective Vaughn and Detective Matthews. They had already been investigating Petty for forgery and Jim for the insurance fraud. So both men are well known to the detectives, and now all of the detectives are,
They see their sus.
yeah, they're like,
You're not adding up, but
Patty
you're
is
adding
a
up very
person,
fast.
yeah. Patty would kind of go on the run, jump around from Australia to Tasmania and back again, leaving his wife to raise their son alone while he forged checks and lived free until he was caught again for those very same forged checks. He found himself back with his family in Sydney and in the market for a cottage he was found one by a family friend near Gunnamatta Bay. It was a typical fishing shack with a kitchen, a couple bedrooms, a boat shelter. This would become the safe house. He told the realtor that he'd like to take it for a couple of months, and they agreed on a rent of 30 shillings a week. Patty gave his name as Williams, which is an alias that he often used. He also gave the address as the new farm in Brisbane. With all of the paperwork complete, Patty put down his deposit and said that he would put the rest in the mail once he returned to Sydney. He did. By the end of March in 1935, he picked up the key and settled in the cottage immediately. He would use his family as a disguise, bringing them down to enjoy summery weekends, all the while saying that there was an agreement and that they were not to be in the cottage if any of Pat's men friends were there. While Patty's enjoying the beach on the boats, Jim is getting obscure messages, such as one morning when a neighborhood boy came round his house to deliver a message saying that Mr. George James had run and could Jim meet him the next day at 9:30 a.m. at the Hotel Sydney. He said that he would like Jim to look after his billiard hall for 8 weeks. While he would like Jim to look after his billiard hall for 8 weeks while he was away. This was a good business prospect. Jim would go into the city that night and came home to tell Gladys that Mr. James had not turned. Throughout the next week, this pattern of messages to meet Mr. James somewhere and then be stood up would continue.
How rude.
Come meet me. Not
Never
there.
mind.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you meet me actually at this time?
Never mind.
Say. Jim and Patty would meet up once more to blackmail 622 pounds. So again, for context, that's 622,000
Mhm.
from Holmes. And we're gonna like fast forward through a haze of booze and blackmail to early April of 1935. On April 8th, Jim woke up around 8 a.m. to get some breakfast. He ate some breakfast, got dressed, and asked his mother-in-law to keep an eye out for his neighbor as he had arranged a ride into town. He left just after 9:30, and that was the last his family had seen of him. He wound up at the Australia Hotel, where he would have lunch with a musician called Sidney Allen, whom he had met the week prior. He would once again pitch his idea for a neon sign company, just saying that he needed to raise a little capital towards the end of the meal. He told Sidney that he was headed to Cronulla. They parted ways about 12:30, with Jim carrying a small bag, and he made his way to Martin Place and took a train to Hartsville and a bus to Bridge and Cronulla, arriving at the Hotel Cecil around 2:30 p.m. He entered the public bar where he was to meet Patty, who wasn't there. He asked the barman if a Mr. Williams, Patty's alias, had left a message, and Levi, the barman, told him that there was a message for Jim to meet Patty down at the wharf. Jim ended up at the wrong wharf because Patty was waiting at a launch in Granada Bay about 400 meters from the Cecil. When Jim didn't turn up, Patty went back to the hotel looking for him. In a series of tag your it, they eventually did find each other and decided to postpone working the launch for another day. Settled into getting fucking drunk, and they drank beer and played dominoes before they would leave their companions. At the end of the night, at the at the 6 o'clock swill next morning. The next morning, Patty would hire a car to take him into town, just giving the driver a general direction towards the city. After a series of twists and turns, they would end up at Lavender Bay, where the driver would take off with his £1 payment. The house Patty ended up at belonged to Holmes, and 40 minutes later, Patty would call a cab to take him back to Cronulla. He'd make a few stops before having the driver drop him off at Gunnamatta Park near the swimming baths. He would make his roundabout way to the cottage, as it seems he was a bit paranoid, choosing to take the scenic route so as to not be seen, in case anybody would be following him. A few days later, he would call on another taxi to take him on to a bunch of secondhand shops where he would buy a mattress, a trunk, a rope, and an anchor. He had the taxi take him all around, looking for people who never showed up until they arrived back at the cottage. The taxi driver assisted him in taking the trunk and the mattress up to the steps of the cottage, where Patty said he had it from there. Patty waited for the taxi driver to leave before entering the cottage. So what's the point of all this clandestine cab rides in the middle of the night, up and down the winding roads of Gunnamatta Bay? What was going on in the cottage? What happened to Jim? Why did Patty need a trunk and a mattress that Friday, April 12th? After all of his hectic meanderings, Patty returned to his wife, making up for all of his neglect and nonsense. She recounts that Patty seemed to have been more at peace than he had ever been in a long time. Growing sick of being at the cottage, Grace and Patty would clean up and leave when the leave. When the landlord came back, he said that the house was clean, but that they had left the boat out littered with garbage and the gas tank empty. But he was pleased that Patty had replaced the rope and anchor that he had previously told the landlord was missing. He also noted, and that was a word from our sponsors. I was telling you the landlord was inspecting the house, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so he's inspecting the house and he notes that a rug's missing and that the tin trunk that he previously had was missing and replaced with a larger and better trunk. He also noticed that the mattress had been replaced. So this explains why Patty was getting those things from the secondhand shops, but there's no explanation as to why they needed to be replaced.
Sit back again. Let's just talk.
Why they needed to be replaced. Patty would jump around from Australia to Tasmania and back again, leaving his wife to raise their son alone while he forged checks and lived free until he was caught again for forging ungodly amounts. He eventually found himself back with his family in Sydney and in the market for a cottage. He was found one by a family friend near Gunnamatta Bay. It was a typical fishing shack with a kitchen and a couple of bedrooms and a boat shelter. This would become his safe house. He told the realtor that he would take it for a couple of months. They agreed on a rent of 30 shillings a week. Patty gave his name as Williams and the address as the new farm in Brisbane. With all the paperwork complete, Patty put down his deposit and said that he would send the rest in the mail once he returned to Sydney, which he did. On March 25th, 1935, he picked up the key and settled in the cottage immediately. He would use his family as a disguise, bringing them down to enjoy summery weekends, all the while saying that there was an agreement and that they were not to be in the cottage if any of Pat's men friends were there. While Patty's enjoying the beach and boats, Jim is getting obscure messages, such as one morning when a neighborhood boy came around his house to deliver a message saying that Mr. George James had rung and asked if Jim could meet him the next day at 9:30 a.m. at the Hotel Sydney. He said that he would like Jim to look after his billiard hall for 8 weeks. While he was away, Jim would go into the city that night and came home to tell Gladys that Mr. James had not turned up. Throughout the week, this pattern of messages to meet Mr. James somewhere and then be stood up would continue. Jim and Patty would meet up once more to blackmail 622 pounds from Holmes, which is 622,000 pounds approximately, which would make me want to kill a motherfucker too. On Monday, April 8th, 1935, Jim woke up around 8 a.m., ate some breakfast, got dressed, and asked his mother-in-law to keep an eye out for his neighbors as he had arranged a ride into town. He left just after 9:30, and that was the last his family had seen of him. He wound up at the Australia Hotel, where he would have lunch with musician Sidney Allen, whom he had met the week prior. He would once again pitch his idea for a neon sign company, saying that he just needed to raise a little capital. Towards the end of the meal, he told Sidney that he was headed to Cronulla. They parted ways about 12:30, with Jim carrying a small bag. He made his way to Martin Place and took the train to Hartsville, and a bus to Bridge in Cronulla, arriving at the Hotel Cecil around 2:30 p.m. He entered the public bar, but Patty wasn't there, so he asked the barman if Mr. Williams had left a message. Barman Levi told him that there was a message for Jim to meet at the wharf. But Jim ended up at the wrong wharf because Patty was waiting at the launch further up the Granada Bay, about 400 meters from the Cecil Hotel. When Jim didn't turn up, Patty went back to the hotel looking for him. In a series of tag you're it, they eventually found each other and decided to postpone working the launch for another day, and then settled in to get fucking drunk. They drank beer and played dominoes before they would leave their companions at the end of the night. The next morning, Patty would hire a car to take him into town, just giving the driver a general direction towards the city. After a series of twists and turns, they would end up at Lavender Bay, where the driver would take off with his £1 payment. The house Patty ended up at belonged to Holmes, who 40 minutes later, Patty called a cab to take him back to Cronulla. He made a few stops before having the driver drop him off at Gunnamatta Bay, near the swimming baths. All this is to say, he made his roundabout way back to the cottage, as it seems he was a bit paranoid of anybody watching him take the scenic route. A few days later, he would call on another taxi to take him on a bunch of errands to second-hand shops, where he would buy a mattress, a trunk. So what was the point of all this clandestine? I still not, it doesn't look like I'm, am I plugged in again?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're in. You just Why are
Alright.
you crouching for it? It
I don't know.
moves.
So, what was the point of all these clandestine cab rides in the middle of the night up and down the winding roads of Gunnamatta Bay? What was going on in the cottage? And what happened to Jim? Why did Patty need a trunk and a mattress that Friday, April 12th? After all of his hectic meanderings, Patty returned to his wife, making up for all of his neglect and nonsense. She recounts later that Patty seemed to have been more at peace than he had been in a long time. Growing sick of being at the cottage, Grace and Patty would clean up and leave. When the landlord had come back, he said that the house was clean, that they had left the boat out, littered with garbage, and the gas tank empty. He, however, was pleased that Patty had replaced the rope and anchor that he told the landlord was missing earlier in the season. The landlord also noted that a rug was missing, that a tin trunk was missing but was replaced with a larger and better trunk, and that a mattress had been replaced with a better one as well. This explains why Patty was going out on errands to retrieve these items, but not why they needed to be replaced in the first place. Something the landlord also found extremely strange was that when he took out a kerosene tin from his pantry, he said that he had left a good amount of kerosene in it, but when he opened, it was practically empty, except for a stinky red substance that, in his opinion, was blood. By this time, Jim had been missing for a week, and his wife was growing ever more desperate. He had never been away from home for more than a few days without contacting her. She would call the Cecil Hotel several times asking if anybody had seen her husband, and though they knew him, they said that they had not seen him for a few days. This lessened her worry, but only by a fraction. On Tuesday, April 23rd, Patty suddenly announced to the long-suffering Grace that they were moving to the other side of the harbor. Grace was upset about this because they didn't have any money. Patty told her not to worry and that he would be able to get some. He gave a call to a mysterious stranger who he would meet up with and return 300 pounds richer. At the same time, Gladys, Jim's wife, was tracking down her husband. She would call on Vaughn, a man whom she was told was supposed to be going on a fishing trip with her husband. He declined having any knowledge of this fishing trip and said that he was given a message that Jim would be gone for a week, returning on Monday, and would give him a call when he got back. Gladys wasn't buying this and told him that she was getting worried and that there was no way to find Jim, except to call the police. Jim advised against this, saying Jim might not be on the up and up, and she doesn't want to get him in trouble with the police. Just give him time to come home. She backed down, but told Vaughn if he saw Jim to have him fucking call her because she was worried. On April 25th, Anzac Day, the Hobsons opened up their aquarium to debut their latest attraction, the melancholy tiger shark that they had caught just a few days earlier. It swam in its small tank before it would vomit the forearm of Jim Smith. Here we are full circle where the story would be sensationalized by the Truth newspaper. When Patty saw the article depicting the description of the boxer tattoo and the rope tied around the wrist, and that the police hoped they could get good fingerprints, he quickly blackmailed one of his proprietors for 6 more pounds and took his family on a journey until the money dried up. Out of options and bitter, a desperate Patty held Holmes responsible for the events at the cottage earlier that April, and he had good reason to be paranoid, as the police had him pegged as the prime suspect from the first day, specifically Detective Sergeant Frank Matthews. Patty was known for his forging, and Jim was a known associate of his. The detectives dispersed all over Cronulla, showing pictures of Jim and Patty, asking if anybody had ever seen them going on together. Much of the information that I have previously stated: the insurance fraud, blackmail, the drug smuggling, the all the other crimes. Yeah. In their interview with Gladys later, she would recount a violent encounter between Jim and Patty over a check. Police said that this could provide a possible motive, seeing as Patty was known for his high-stakes forging. They showed her a picture of Patty in a letter that was supposedly from Jim, which was written as follows: May 1st, 1935. Son, keep your mother quiet. I am in a jam. I plead it's okay. Call the cops off. Tell your mom I will have plenty soon, and we will be all right. They want me something in town. Never mind. Be a man for me. Your loving father, Jim Smith. Destroy this. Gladys told the detectives that it resembled her husband's handwriting, but it certainly wasn't his, and that it seemed to her to be a clumsy attempt at making it seem as if Jim was still alive. Later that week, a message would be given to the neighbor by a man with a gruff voice, asking her to say that Jim would not be home until the following Monday. The detectives asked dete- bleh. The detectives asked Gladys how many people had her phone number, and she said only a few, one of which was Patty. This gave them enough reason to make this gave them enough reason to feel as if Patty was their man, so they went in search of him. They knew Fatty. Nope. Sorry. They knew Patty was a family man, and that his family supported him wholly, often coddling him throughout life, especially when he was in trouble. They used this to their advantage. They handpicked some wonderful police officers who were trained to keep criminals under surveillance and gave them immediate instructions to set up a watch. To set up a watch on his family members as they headed to Cronulla and the Hotel Cecil, where the barman identified Jim and Patty from their photos. He revealed that Patty had given his name as Williams and that he had a cottage somewhere nearby, and probably a boat as well, as he left a message for Jim to meet him at the wharf. Although they, got all their meeting times mixed up. Now the detectives had a motive and a last scene with. They pursued the petty criminal with the utmost vigor. They investigated the cottage, but ultimately it didn't reveal anything and was deemed to be inconclusive. It was clean and sparse, with the only strangeness being that the furniture had been replaced with better furniture. Their investigation began to form a picture of a possible murder happening in the cottage, however. However, they deemed the tin trunk however they bleh, however they deemed that the tin trunk described by the owner would have been possible to hold a body. They said that the mattress had been switched out.
There.
Their investigation began to form a picture of a possible murder happening in the cottage. However, they deemed that the tin trunk described by the owner would have been possible to hold a body. They said because the mattress had been switched out, that is probably where Jim Smith had been killed, and that his body had been wrapped up in the mattress and the rug to soak up the blood uh, to soak up the blood. They surmised that the arm could have been cut off because it didn't fit in the trunk, or was to be used as proof of the murder. They looked out into the bay, the waters a perfect dumping ground for evidence. However, the cottage only came with a dinghy, which proved to be too small to carry out two men and a trunk. Canvassing the neighborhood, they found a neighbor that had rented Williams, Patty, a 17-foot launch with a motor during his stay at the cottage. This would tighten the rope around Patty's neck. The detectives speculated that Jim Smith had been lured to the cottage, where he was killed and dismembered, with his body being stuffed into the trunk, which was then bound with rope, weighed down with the anchor, and lifted on the boat, taken out into the port, and dropped overboard. The cottage hedgeman thoroughly cleaned, removing all traces of blood and viscera, removing the rug and mattress and anything that they could find except for the arm. Now they just needed proof. They would go on to dredge the port, using grappling irons from the boats and using spotters flying overhead. Hearing from the neighbors that Patty would often take taxis, they sent Detective Constable Milton Coleman to canvass all of the taxi depots and private car operations in the city and the south suburbs. So this is why I was mentioning, like, he gets in a cab going here, and it's with a large area with many taxis and car for hire services. But as luck would have it, um, Detective Coleman would find the needle in the haystack relatively soon when a Herbert McGowan of Orange Top Cabs based out in Kensington recognized Patty's photo and told his story of the journey of him buying the trunk, and the mattress, and taking him to the cottage in Cronulla. Detective Matthews was overjoyed, for here he had circumstantial evidence that Patty was involved in the covering up of Jim Smith's murder. Because, like, why else is he buying all of the stuff to replace shit in a cottage? Like, yeah, maybe, I don't know, he pissed and vomited all over the mattress, but, like, why are you replacing the trunk?
Right.
Why the trunk? Why?
Why?
Like, I'm house sitting for you, Autumn, and I'm just gonna randomly, like, well, okay, maybe in our situation that actually might be possible. I'd be like, oh, this janky old trunk that you got from fucking Walmart needs to go. I found you
That
this
would be
vintage.
possible.
Okay,
That
so
would be possible. I could see it, but also, just why?
yeah,
Was it
just
necessary? The landlord didn't seem to think it was necessary.
didn't seem to like it was better stuff too. It's not
Yeah.
like, I mean, thanks for all the fish, whatever. Okay. While the investigation was going on, Patty would harass Holmes's wife, calling every day to ask when Holmes would return. He skipped town because he didn't want to be associated with everything going on here. This nuisance would have Holmes's wife, making him return from his happy place sooner rather than later. Immediately upon his return, Petty would leech onto him, extorting more money. And of course, this old trick was getting old. And on the following night, Wednesday, May 15th, after a phone call to Holmes, Petty would be greeted outside of his hotel rooms by Detectives McDermott, Coleman, and Coleman. The jig was up, and they made Petty get dressed and took him down to the station. He was now to become the subject of unrelenting questioning. Matthews would play mind games in order to break him, as he was convinced of Petty's guilt. Based on Professor Alex Castle's interviews with Detective Allman and Coleman in his book 1995 The Shark Arm Murders, this is how the interrogation went down. And that'll end part 1.
Dum, dum. You know, it'll be more cohesive than it actually was recording. So,
Let's hope. But
just
yeah,
so you know, there was at least one interruption every 15 minutes, but we got it done.
every 15 seconds. I had to find my recording voice back there. It wasn't smooth.
It was a whole thing, so hopefully,
This 20 minutes took over an hour.
I don't think it would have been 20 minutes. I think you're looking at least 40 minutes.
You think 45?
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
either way, that's why it's in 2 parts. We
yeah.
still have 16 more pages to go. Ish, roughly. Yeah, there's an outro recorded already.
We're done.
Bye. And that, my pretties, is all we have for you today. If you like that episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Word of mouth is the best advertising, and we truly appreciate the solid. If you'd like to view our resources or leave us any comments on our research and write-ups, visit don'tyouknowpod.com and visit our socials. From Facebook to Mastodon, everything is at Don't You Know Pod. Links in the show notes. Thanks for joining us, and don't forget to lock your doors.